So in this video, I'm going to do a sociology revision video of interactionist explanations of crime. And interactionists, unlike functionalists or Marxists or feminists, they're not kind of structural theorists, so it's not a top-down, they're more looking at the small-scale interactions between individuals. So the first main theorist, the first sociologist who came up with a lot of these ideas was Becker in 1963 with the concept of labeling. And what Howard Becker argued there is that it's actually the label that makes something deviant or criminal. So the idea that, and it's quite a radical idea, that no act is inherently deviant or criminal. So it's relative. So for example, if you take murder, killing someone, in some situations, that is acceptable. Okay, so if you think on a battlefield, you would be rewarded, you might get a medal for killing someone in war. Whereas if you did that on the street, you'd be put in prison. So what this is, it depends on the situation. It depends how that act is labelled. There's lots of other things that you could talk about. In certain situations, something's deviant or criminal. In other situations, it's not. So that's what Becker is talking about, this idea of labeling. So it's focusing on the societal response to specific acts. Okay, this label. And this can work with individuals as well. So you can label somebody as a troublemaker. And what Becker argues is this can then become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that person takes on board this label, and it has an impact on their identity, how they see themselves, and they then become a troublemaker. So if you think about a teacher labeling a student, for example, as a troublemaker and telling them off, maybe doing it a few times, and then the student thinks, well, what's the point in trying hard? The teacher doesn't like me. I'm not going to try hard. I'm just going to mess around anyway. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Similarly, this idea of the master status, where the label overrides all other aspects of identity. So it could be that you're labeled as a criminal, and that overrides all other aspects. So you might be a father, you might be a brother, etc. But it's the criminal thing. People think, oh, that person went to prison, they're a criminal. That is a master status. So that's Becker's labeling theory in really, really briefly. But in terms of evaluation, what are some issues with this? Well, it ignores the initial act. So perhaps somebody did something to become a trouble, to be labelled as a deviant. It doesn't explain why somebody did the initial act. It explains the secondary act. It explains why somebody might do it again if they've got this self-fulfilling prophecy, but it doesn't explain why they did it in the first place. So that's a little bit of a kind of problem with it. Also, there might be some acts that we could say are always inherently deviant. Something like abuse, there might be things that you think, well, that's never, in no situation would that be seen as okay, doing something against somebody's will, something like that. So there might be a slight issue with that. Also, some people have argued that this is deterministic. Does everybody who is labelled become that label? Perhaps people can overcome that label. Okay, and there's lots of examples you can find of people who've kind of turned their lives around and things like that. But it is a very useful concept. Next, we go on to Edwin Lemert in 1972, talking about primary and secondary deviance. So this is really, it's similar to Becker, it's building on Becker. And what Lemert talks about here is that basically that primary deviance is the deviant act that isn't publicly labelled. And Lemert says that's not very important. So it's an act somebody does, it's not publicly labelled. The secondary deviance is the thing that we are really interested in as sociologists. So the secondary deviance is the response of the individual to the societal reaction. And this is a major cause of deviance. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like when you've been labelled and you think, well, I'm going to do it anyway. People think I'm a troublemaker. I might as well just do it. So that's the cause of deviance. So the secondary deviance, Lemert's secondary deviance, is building on Becker, building on this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. In terms of evaluation, what about deviance that isn't ever publicly labelled? So domestic abuse, fraud, these things might be done behind closed doors. It's not ever publicly labelled, and Lemert isn't really explaining that. Okay, so this is useful for things that have been publicly labeled and people kind of acting out when they've been labeled, but it's not really useful, again, explaining the initial acts that aren't labeled. Okay, moving on to Cicourel and the negotiation of justice. And Cicourel, again, it's about labeling, it's about the way we're kind of interacting. And Cicourel finds a close relationship between social class and delinquency. So, in terms of law enforcement, police officers, judges, etc., what Cicourel argued is that working class offenders were and it really took about male youth, seen as kind of typical criminals by those in law enforcement. So they were thought, well, they're always going to be a criminal. We might as well kind of lock them up, give them a harsh sentence. Whereas middle class offenders, who were more likely to be able to kind of negotiate their way out, they weren't seen as inherently deviant, inherently criminal. They're more likely to be given a second chance. So this is the idea of the negotiation of justice, that justice isn't set. You can have two people who did the same thing, one who's working class, and maybe the way they talk, the way they look, the way they dress, the way they interact with the people in authority, it makes those in authority think, well, they are a kind of typical criminal. That's what we think of as criminals. Whereas the middle class, maybe they can almost talk their way out of it. So it's this negotiation of justice. In terms of evaluation, Marxists have argued that Cicourel doesn't really explain the power dynamic, doesn't really get into that. Well, why is it that working class offenders are seen as typical criminal? Marxists would say it's because of capitalism. It's because of inequality. Okay, and Cicourel doesn't really get into that. He's talking about the interactions. Okay, so moving on, we've got two more. Both of these are focused on the media now. The first one is Jock Young, talking about deviancy amplification, and this is from a study he did in 1971 of hippies in Notting Hill. And what Young found, again, I'm going into this just really briefly, just to give a kind of revision overview, is that Young found that the media portrayal of the drug taking by the hippies, when the media picked up on this, it created what he calls deviance amplification. So it was this kind of media portrayal of the drug taking that led to the hippies taking on drug taking as central part of their identity. So people saw hippies as drug takers, and then hippies kind of made it part of their self-identity. They took that on board, and they therefore made drug taking central to who they were. And this, Young calls this the deviancy amplification spiral. So the media report it, almost like it's publicly labeled. The police go looking for it. The hippies take it on. Therefore, there's more of it. The media continue to report it. Police look for it, etc., etc. So it's this amplification spiral. And in terms of evaluation, I think it is a really useful study at looking at the impact of the media, that the media, and the next one we're going to look at, moral panics, it can create more deviance by amplifying it. People get involved. Again, I've done a video on the London riots where you could argue more people got involved because of the media portrayal. So this, I think, is a useful study for looking at the deviance that's reported by the media. There might be more recent examples that you can think of to bring in as a contemporary example where the media have reported something and it becomes this kind of amplification, perhaps kind of TikTok trends or something like that you could talk about. Okay, last one is Cohen's absolute classic study on folk devils and moral panics. And Cohen is writing in 1972, looking back at the kind of tabloid media portrayal of the mods and rockers who were fighting on bank holidays in the 1960s. And Cohen really argues that the media really over-exaggerated the violence of the mods and rockers, that it wasn't really a big thing, it was very peripheral, and then by the media reporting it so much, it amplifies it, it becomes greater, it creates this moral panic in society, and then everybody associates mods and rockers with violence, whereas actually it was initially quite a kind of peripheral thing. Also, he brings in the idea of the moral entrepreneurs, so politicians, journalists, people who speak out against these groups. And it's almost like society's kind of spokespeople who speak out on this. And what Cohen also argues here is that moral panics are a response to societal change. So if you know about the 1960s, it's the emergence of youth culture, youth subcultures, and this is, Cohen argues, this is a way of society kind of trying to come to terms with this. Who are these people? Who are these groups? What are they doing? They're different from the youth of the past, or if there wasn't even perhaps this period of youth of the past. In terms of evaluation, how useful do you think moral panics are in the 21st century? Do we still have moral panics? Do you think tabloid media has that impact? Some people have argued that actually tabloid media doesn't have that impact anymore. However, a more recent example is Forbert's study of hoodies in 2008, which looked at the kind of moral panic about hoodies at that time, and this, some places banned hoodies from certain shopping centres and things like that. So you could say actually it's still relevant today, or still relevant for the 21st century. Okay, I hope that was useful run through of the key interactionist explanations of crime. If you've got any questions, please leave a comment. Thanks for listening.